Without me, she'd be homeless. My father's voice cracked through that courtroom like a rifle shot. Even the court reporter's fingers froze for half a second. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the gallery. I didn't look up. I kept my hands folded in my lap and stared at the worn wooden railing while the ceiling fan overhead turned slow and useless in the Savannah heat. Some rooms hold weather in them. Courtroom 3 held 40 years of things nobody had said out loud. Then Judge Whitmore did something unexpected. He looked directly at me, not at my attorney, not at my father, at me, and in a voice so measured it almost sounded like a warning, he said, "So they really don't know." The room went still in a different way now, not polite quiet, but stunned quiet. My father's attorney blinked hard. "Your Honor, know what?" Whitmore leaned back slowly in his chair. "Actually, she is." He stopped himself deliberately. That was the moment the color drained from my father's face. But none of that happened first. The truth is, my life had already come undone long before I ever set foot in that courtroom. What made it lonelier than it should have been was this. My own family never noticed a single thing. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 61 years old, divorced, retired, and until very recently, the entire city of Savannah believed I was a worn-out woman coasting on her father's charity. I let them believe it. By the time the lawsuit began, I'd been living quietly at the Hayes estate for nearly 7 years, a property just outside Savannah near the Isle of Hope, tucked behind cathedral oaks dripping Spanish moss. Old Southern money architecture. Wide porches, tall windows, cracked brick paths. The kind of house people slow their cars to admire. My father loved telling people it had belonged to the Hayes family for generations. That wasn't strictly true, but I let people believe what they needed to believe. Most mornings I woke before sunrise, made black coffee, and sat on the back porch listening to cicadas while the river breeze moved through the trees. After the kind of life I'd lived, silence becomes something you protect carefully. 3 mornings a week I volunteered at the VA clinic downtown. Most people there knew me simply as Maggie. That was more than enough. I helped veterans navigate paperwork, drove a few to appointments, and sometimes simply sat beside old soldiers who needed someone willing to stay through the stories everyone else had stopped listening to. That generation understood something important about silence, when it meant respect and when it meant fear. My father, Walter Hayes, understood neither. At 82, he still moved through every room like he owned the air inside it. He'd built a successful construction company in the booming Savannah of the 70s and 80s, back when being loud and cert looked exactly like being right. My mother's death 12 years ago stripped away whatever softness had kept him tolerable. He became harder after that, not dramatically, not in ways anyone outside the family would easily see, but in small, precise cruelties. My brother Daniel could survive anything in my father's eyes. Didn't matter that Daniel was 58 years old and sinking under failed real estate ventures. At church breakfasts, Walter still introduced him like he was 40 and ascending. Me, I was Margaret, the name said with a certain weight, like a heavy stone held just before it drops. She never recovered after the divorce, he'd whisper to neighbors. She lives here because family takes care of family. The truth sat in plain sight every single day. He never once looked at it. The Sunday dinner that started everything happened in late August, when Savannah's heat turns the air into something you have to push through rather than breathe. Daniel arrived wearing loafers without socks, phone pressed to his ear, talking loudly about a condo development that almost certainly didn't exist. His wife Crystal set a store-bought peach pie on the counter and sighed as though the drive had nearly killed her. I'd made pot roast. Nobody thanked me, that wasn't unusual. Halfway through dinner, my father dabbed his mouth with a cloth napkin and said it the way you'd say you'd decided to change the cable package. I've decided to sell the property. I looked up slowly. Daniel froze mid-bite. The taxes are becoming unreasonable, my father continued. This place is too much house now. He glanced at me with something that wasn't quite compassion. So you'll need to make arrangements, Margaret. Crystal suddenly became fascinated with the table. Daniel's eyes dropped to his sweet tea. I set my fork down with the quiet care of someone who has diffused things in worse situations than this. You can't sell it. The room went the way rooms go, when someone says exactly the thing that wasn't supposed to be said. My father laughed once, a short dismissive sound. I'm sorry. You can't L the estate. His eyes narrowed in the way they had my entire childhood, right before he decided someone needed bringing down to size. I believe I know what I own. No, I said calmly, you don't. Daniel jumped in with the desperation of a man trying to stop a car already over the cliff. Come on, Maggie, not tonight. But my father was already somewhere past listening. You've lived under my roof for 7 years. His voice had found its edge. Without me, you'd be in some government apartment somewhere. Government apartment, I almost smiled at that. Instead I stood, gathered plates, and said quietly, talk to a lawyer before you try to sell it. That only made things worse, which I had expected. Within 10 days, I was served with eviction papers. Daniel called afterward pretending to sound sympathetic. You know how Dad gets, he sighed. Just apologize and this goes away. Apologize for what? A long silence. Then, you always have to make things difficult. I nearly laughed, not bitterly, more with the exhausted recognition of someone who has seen this particular play too many times. Families assign people roles early and defend those roles ferociously, even when reality has long since moved on. Daniel was the golden son. I was the disappointment. No amount of truth was allowed to interrupt that arrangement. The lawsuit spread through Savannah the way summer thunderstorms do, fast, loud, and briefly making everything else irrelevant. At the diner near Waters Avenue, conversations paused when I walked in. Poor Margaret, living off her father, probably still not right after the divorce. I heard it all. I let them talk. After 30 years in military intelligence, you learn something that civilians rarely understand. People expose themselves completely when they believe you're powerless. They stop performing. They show you exactly who they are. 2 weeks before the first hearing, I stopped by the courthouse to file paperwork with my attorney, Patricia Hale, 73 years old, sharp enough to draw blood, and one of the very few people in the state of Georgia who knew the full truth about me. As we crossed the lobby together, an elderly bailiff looked up from his desk. The moment his eyes landed on me, something changed in his posture. Spine straight, shoulders back, a subtle, instinctive adjustment. Good afternoon, ma'am, he said quietly. Not Miss Hayes, not Margaret. Ma'am. Patricia noticed. Across the lobby, so did my father and Daniel. For a single, unguarded second I watched uncertainty flicker across my father's face, there and gone, swallowed by pride before it could mean anything. The first hearing fell on a Tuesday morning in September, a week after heavy rains had left Savannah smelling like wet stone and magnolia. The courthouse steps were still slick. Local reporters clustered outside with coffee cups and cameras. Small cities are hungry for each other's embarrassments. I arrived alone in my old blue pickup wearing a plain gray suit I'd owned for years. No jewelry except my wedding ring, which I still wore even now. Harold had been gone 4 years, but some habits outlast grief by a wide margin. Across the street, my father stood near the entrance shaking hands like a man running for something, Daniel hovering beside him with folders and an expression of studied importance. Walter spotted me and called out loudly enough for the reporters to catch it. Morning, Margaret. Hope you brought somewhere to stay after this. A few people laughed uncertainly. I kept walking. Military service teaches you this. If you react to every insult, your enemies learn to control your pulse rate. An unreadable face is a form of armor. I had been wearing mine for decades. Patricia met me at the security checkpoint, looking as unmoved by the crowd as she always did. Still time to end this quietly, she said. I tried quiet for 40 years. She nodded once and said nothing else. Courtroom 3 sat on the second floor with a view over Reynolds Square. Old wooden benches, carpet worn thin down the center, air conditioning that suggested rather than delivered coolness. The room smelled like decades of other people's worst days. I'd sat in rooms like this overseas, different languages, different flags, same charged air of lives being decided. Before proceedings began, I noticed something. Scattered through the gallery, several veterans from the VA clinic. Mr. Delaney, Frank Morrison, retired Marine Corps, even old Benson, who rarely left the house anymore because of his breathing. None of them looked directly at me, but they'd come. That mattered in a way I couldn't quite articulate. My father's attorney, Richard Coleman, arrived at our table with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent 40 years mistaking other people's restraint for weakness. "Mrs. Hayes," he said pleasantly, "my client is still willing to spare you further embarrassment if you vacate voluntarily." Patricia answered before I could. "LD, form a word. My client isn't interested." Coleman sighed with the theatrical disappointment of a man who'd rehearsed it. "That's unfortunate." It really wasn't. Judge Whitmore entered precisely at 9. The room rose. When he saw my nameplate at the defense table, something moved briefly across his expression, not quite surprise, more like recognition. Then it was gone. The hearing followed its expected shape. Property records, residency history, financial disclosures. Coleman performed constantly, treating the gallery like an audience he needed to win. My client generously allowed his emotionally struggling daughter to remain in the residence following her divorce, he announced, despite her inability to support herself independently. Emotionally struggling, I kept my eyes on the table. I had sat across from men in overseas briefings who threatened lives with the casual ease of ordering breakfast. Richard Coleman was noise wearing a necktie, but I won't pretend it didn't carry weight. There's a particular kind of pain in sitting still while strangers measure your value like a broken appliance, especially when your own father nods along to every word. Coleman held up photographs of the estate with the satisfaction of a man closing a deal. "This property has belonged to the Hayes family for decades. Mr. Hayes paid taxes, maintained the grounds, covered utilities, while his daughter contributed, in essence, nothing." The judge glanced toward Patricia. She didn't move, didn't object, didn't so much as shift in her seat. Her stillness unnerved Coleman more than any argument would have. During recess, I stood in the hallway near a window overlooking the square. A younger deputy approached quietly. "Excuse me, ma'am." I turned. He looked slightly nervous in the way that certain people do when they've just realized who they're talking to. "Judge Whitmore asked me to make sure you have anything you need." I studied him, mid-30s, former military. The posture gave it away before anything else. "I'm fine," I said. He hesitated, then nodded with a precision that wasn't quite civilian. "Yes, ma'am." Across the hallway, Daniel watched the whole exchange with visible confusion, as though someone had handed him a document in a language he didn't know existed. That afternoon, Daniel testified. "Watching my younger brother lie under oath was more exhausting than dramatic. She's always depended on Dad," he told the court carefully, "emotionally and financially." I almost interrupted. Almost because 15 years earlier, Daniel had called me from a casino parking lot in Biloxi at 3 in the morning, sobbing and terrified. I'd wired him $40,000 before sunrise. No lecture, no conditions, no receipt required, just, "Your family, this is what family does." He couldn't look at me when he left the stand. Cowardice often wears the face of confidence, right up until real pressure arrives. Near the end of that first hearing, Judge Whitmore was reviewing documents in the quiet, methodical way of a man who reads everything twice. Then he stopped. A sustained silence filled the room the way silence does when something has shifted and nobody has said so yet. He adjusted his glasses slowly. "Read one page again." Then he looked directly at me, not with hostility, not with pity, but with a careful, unmistakable respect. My father noticed it before anyone else did. "Your Honor," Coleman prompted, clearly unsettled. Whitmore closed the folder. "There appear to be additional ownership records that require verification." "We submitted complete documentation." "Apparently not." The room tightened. My father leaned toward his lawyer, whispering with urgent force. Whitmore continued evenly. "I'm scheduling a second hearing in 2 weeks." Coleman stood too quickly. "With respect, Your Honor, this is a straightforward eviction matter." "No," the judge's tone didn't rise. It simply became final. He glanced toward me once more. "It may not be." That sentence followed us all the way down the courthouse steps. Outside, my father worked the reporters with practiced ease, smiling for cameras like a man who had already won. But I saw what others missed. For the first time since filing this lawsuit, Walter Hayes looked uncertain. Not confused, uncertain, which meant somewhere beneath the performance he was afraid. The second hearing drew twice as many people. Savannah had graduated the case from local news to communal entertainment. By the morning it was scheduled, I'd been stared at in 2 grocery stores, 3 diners, and my own church pew. Poor Margaret, losing her home, suing her own father, not one of them knew a single true thing. Rain hammered the estate roof before sunrise. I stood on the back porch with my coffee, watching water pool along the old brick paths. Those oak trees had survived hurricanes. The house had outlasted floods and 3 generations of pride and silence. And it had never, not once, not legal. Not financially, belonged to the Hayes family at all. Patricia arrived at 8:30. Ready. No, I said honestly. She nodded once. Good, means you're still paying attention. The courtroom was already full. 2 news vans sat outside. My father arrived like he always did, shoulders back, chin up, hand out, the whole performance of a man who believed the world was watching him favorably. Daniel trailed behind in an expensive suit that his credit card statement probably couldn't justify. Walter spotted me across the street and smiled the cold, contained smile he'd used on me since childhood, the one that meant I have already won this. It disappeared 43 minutes later. Coleman opened aggressively, sensing that the previous hearing had left things unresolved in ways he needed to seal. Your Honor, this matter has consumed enough time. The facts remain unchanged. Mr. Walter Hayes owns the property. His daughter resides there without legal standing. We have submitted tax records, maintenance receipts, utility bills. Submitted by whom? Patricia said quietly. Coleman frowned. By the property owner. Patricia slid a folder across to the bailiff. That assumption appears to be incorrect. The courtroom shifted. My father crossed his arms with the reflex of a man who has always used physical size to close conversations. Patricia stood. In 15 years of knowing her, I had never once seen her nervous. Your Honor, the estate known as Hayes Manor was purchased in 1998 under a private defense trust registered in Virginia. Coleman laughed, actually laughed. That's impossible. The trust's sole financial contributor and controlling beneficiary, Patricia continued, undisturbed, is Margaret Hayes. The silence that followed was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that changes the air pressure in a room. My father's mouth moved without sound for a moment. Daniel stared at me the way you stare at someone whose face you thought you knew, when you suddenly realize you've been looking at the wrong person entirely. Coleman recovered fastest because that's what he was paid for. Even granting some trust exists, that doesn't explain. It explains quite a lot, Whitmore said softly. My father leaned forward, voice tight. Margaret doesn't have that kind of money. Nobody answered him, because the only honest answer was, that's been true for a long time and you never thought to ask why. Patricia opened a second folder. For 31 years, she said, with the composure of someone reading a weather report, my client served in the United States Naval Intelligence. The room went somewhere beyond silence. Daniel whispered, What? My father laughed, once broken, reflexive. That's ridiculous. Margaret Hayes, Patricia continued, retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. The weight of that landed differently than I'd expected. Not like a revelation, more like a stone dropping into still water. The ripples moved outward, slowly, reaching every corner of the room. Judge Whitmore looked toward the gallery. As certain records in this matter remain partially classified, this court will not discuss operational details. Operational details. You could feel those 2 words recalibrate the room. My father had gone the color of old plaster. Daniel looked as though he might be sick. Coleman attempted 2 separate sentences and finished neither. Your Honor, surely military service has no bearing on property ownership. No, Whitmore said quietly, but integrity does. Patricia presented everything then. The financial records, the trust documents, the purchase agreements, the wire transfers. Every thread led back to me. The estate had never legally belonged to Walter Hayes, not for a single day. 26 years earlier, after my second overseas deployment, I discovered my father's construction company was quietly collapsing under debt he'd never admitted to anyone. I bought the estate through a protected trust before the creditors could touch it. I structured it so he'd never know the source. At the time, letting him keep his dignity seemed more important than claiming my own. For 26 years, I had been his landlord. He had no idea. My father shook his head slowly, the way people do when the math simply refuses to resolve. No, this can't be right. It is right, I said quietly. My own voice startled him. He looked at me across that courtroom, not with the cold authority he'd worn my entire life, but with something raw and genuinely lost. You bought this house. Yes. Why would you do that? That question nearly cracked something in my chest, because he truly didn't know. There was no performance in it. He had spent decades believing a story about himself and his family, and the story had simply never included room for this version of me. I looked at the old man across from me and remembered the father who taught me to ride a bicycle on the cracked sidewalk outside our first house. Who stood at the end of my childhood bed when I had pneumonia and didn't know what to say, so said nothing but stayed. Because you were my father, I said. His eyes filled immediately. But Patricia wasn't finished. She laid out the rest with the same quiet precision. My mother's cancer treatments, covered. Daniel's catastrophic gambling debt 15 years ago, covered. The back taxes that would have put the estate into receivership during the recession, covered. Every time this family had quietly approached the edge, an invisible hand had pulled them back. My hand. And still, I had become the family disappointment. The room no longer looked at my father the way rooms usually do. The admiration had been replaced by something more uncomfortable. The particular discomfort of witnessing a person realize, in public, that the story they built their entire life around was not the story that was true. Judge Whitmore removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes like a man who has read too much in one sitting. Then he looked at my father directly. Mr. Hayes, I would strongly advise against continuing this action. Walter barely heard him. He was still looking at me like a man trying to locate himself in a map he no longer recognizes. Nobody approached my father in the hallway after. That was the first thing I noticed. Walter Hayes had spent decades moving through Savannah like a current that people moved with, greeted him, deferred to. But outside courtroom 3 that afternoon, people simply stepped aside and looked at their shoes. Daniel tried quietly steering him toward the exit. Dad, let's go now. But Walter walked toward me instead, slowly, like a man crossing unfamiliar ground. I thought for a moment that he might apologize, instead. How long? I looked at him. How long were you planning to humiliate me? The question landed harder than I expected, not because it was cruel, but because he meant it. Even now, after everything laid bare, he still believed himself the injured party. Grief can do that to pride. It calcifies it. I wasn't, I said. He laughed with his teeth. You let me stand in there looking like a fool. You filed the lawsuit, Walter, Patricia said. But he was past hearing her. All these years, he said, quieter now, the anger losing its edges. You just let people think I was taking care of you. Yes. Why? I opened my mouth, closed it. The truthful answer, because I loved you, and love sometimes looks like making someone feel larger than they are, felt too enormous and too tender for a courthouse hallway with reporters already pressing toward us. It seemed easier, I said. His face twisted into something I hadn't seen before, the intersection of anger and shame, two emotions fighting for the same face. Then the reporters arrived. Admiral Hayes, is it true you led naval intelligence operations in the Gulf? Did you receive the Distinguished Service Medal? Why did you keep your military career private? Walter stared at the cameras in absolute disbelief. You could watch the precise moment he understood that this wasn't a bad afternoon. This was going to follow him. By evening, all of Savannah knew. I stopped for groceries on the drive home. The cashier nearly dropped an entire carton of eggs when she recognized me. "Oh my lord," she whispered, "you're that woman from the courthouse." That woman, not poor Margaret anymore. An older man near the register removed his veteran's cap when I passed. "Vietnam Navy, ma'am," he said quietly. "At ease, sailor." He laughed until his eyes watered. Not everyone reacted that way. Daniel arrived at the estate around 7 that evening, in a fury that preceded him up the driveway. "You humiliated Dad in front of the entire city." I stayed on the porch swing. "He humiliated himself." "That's not fair and you know it." I looked at my younger brother carefully. For the first time in decades, underneath the anger, he looked genuinely frightened. Not of me, of the ground shifting under an entire life he'd built on assumptions. "You lied to us," he said. I stayed quiet. "Those aren't the same thing." He paced the porch. "You made Dad look weak." That sentence explained everything, not that it was cruel, but that weak was the thing that mattered. Not unfair, not unkind. Weak. Because in this family, weakness had always been the only unforgivable sin. I took a breath. "Did you ever once ask where your business bailout came from, 15 years ago?" His face changed. There it was. "You said it was an anonymous investor," he whispered. "It was." "Oh God." "You were about to lose everything, Daniel. It was 3 in the morning and Mom called me crying." He sat down heavily in the porch chair. For a while neither of us spoke. The cicadas went on regardless. Finally, he asked the question I had privately waited years to hear. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked out toward the dark shapes of the oak trees. "Because once people know what you are," I said, "they stop seeing who you are." That wasn't entirely honest. The real answer was simpler and uglier. I was tired. After 30 years in military intelligence, burying friends, carrying classified weight, attending funerals nobody could explain to the people left behind, I didn't want to be Rear Admiral Margaret Hayes anymore. I just wanted to be someone's daughter. To sit at a dinner table and have someone ask how I was doing and mean it. But my family only respected power they could see clearly. Everything else they dismissed. By the next morning, reporters had assembled outside the estate gates. Old photographs surfaced online, me in uniform beside senior Navy officials, me on the deck of a carrier, me receiving medals at ceremonies I barely remember now. Savannah lost its collective mind. At the VA clinic, veterans who nodded politely for years now stood when I entered. I hated that part. Rank-based respect has always felt emptier to me than the kind built quietly over time. Frank Morrison cornered me near the coffee machine that Thursday afternoon. 2 tour in Vietnam with the Marines, opinions about everything. "You should have told people," he muttered. "And listened to everyone salute me for 20 years. Better than letting your old man treat you like furniture." That landed somewhere, it didn't easily leave. He leaned against the counter. "Men like your father," he said quietly, "don't know what to do with daughters who become stronger than them." I looked away. He wasn't wrong, and I'd known it for a long time. My father hadn't recovered. Walter had stopped going to church, stopped golfing, stopped meeting his friends downtown. In a city this size, shame travels faster than forgiveness, and proud men rarely survive being whispered about. Some people privately admired him for standing up to his daughter. Others thought him a fool for dragging a decorated officer into a public courtroom. Either way, he had become a story, and proud men are not built to survive being reduced to a story. Daniel's situation unraveled faster than I expected. For years he'd been building his life over invisible nets I'd quietly stretched beneath him. Once I stopped catching things, the loans surfaced quickly. One Friday evening he appeared at the estate driving a rental with a cracked windshield. The Mercedes was gone. "You busy?" he asked at the foot of the porch steps. "Never too busy for family." Those words almost broke him. We sat outside while the last light moved through the trees. He told me everything, the gambling that had never actually stopped, the loans with ugly terms, the fake development proposals, the second mortgage on his house. It was like listening to a much younger version of my father. Pride, fear, performance. The exhausting trinity of men who have been taught that admitting need is the same as admitting failure. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed, he said. That's usually how it gets worse. He nodded slowly. Then, did you really pay off my casino debt? Yes. Why? Because Mom called me crying. He covered his face with both hands. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I genuinely had not prepared for. I think Dad hated you because you never needed his approval. I sat with that because the truth was more complicated. I had needed it desperately once. At 23, leaving for my first naval posting overseas, I had waited an entire evening for my father to say he was proud of me. He never did. After a while, you stop waiting. And then later, you realize you stopped and you grieve that too. Around midnight, 2 days later, Patricia called. Your father's in Memorial Hospital. I was on my feet before she finished. What happened? Minor stroke. Daniel found him collapsed in a motel room. A motel room. Walter Hayes, who had once owned every room he walked into, was renting a single room on Highway 80 rather than share a house with the truth about his daughter. I drove through pouring rain. Daniel sat outside the emergency wing looking hollowed out. He kept saying he didn't need help, he said when he saw me, even when they were loading him onto the gurney. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. My father looked smaller somehow in that bed, not diminished exactly, but human in a way I hadn't been allowed to see in a very long time. An old man, just that. He opened his eyes when I came in, and before I could say a word, tears gathered. I'm sorry, he whispered. Just those 2 words, no conditions attached, no repositioning to protect his dignity, just I'm sorry. I sat beside the bed. You don't have to talk right now. Yes, I do, his voice caught. All those years you were protecting us. He looked at his own hands. I punished you for becoming everything I never was. That sentence broke something in me, not because it was a surprise, because it was a confirmation of something I'd always known and never wanted to be right. Out. He reached for my hand carefully, the way people do when they're not sure they've earned the right. I was proud of you, he said. I just never learned how to say it. I was 61 years old, retired, a widow, a rear admiral with a classified career behind me, and those words, I was proud of you, still hit me somewhere that hadn't finished growing. Sometimes too late is all we get. Sometimes it still counts for something anyway. Winter moved into Savannah slowly that year. The oaks around the estate stood bare and patient, branches reaching over the property like something between shelter and remembrance. The house felt different, not resolved, but easier. Something long held tightly had finally been set down. My father came home from the hospital 3 weeks before Christmas, not to reclaim anything, just to recover. I converted the downstairs study into a bedroom because climbing stairs had become difficult. He resisted every small kindness the way proud men do, right up until they don't anymore. I can manage myself, he muttered the first morning I brought coffee. I know, I said, but you don't have to anymore. That usually quieted him. Recovery did something to Walter that age alone had never managed. Before the stroke, he moved through the world as though constantly defending territory nobody was trying to take. After, something underneath that defense became visible, something older and less certain, like the original structure of a building after the facade comes off. Some mornings I found him on the back porch, simply watching sunlight travel through the trees, doing nothing else, needing nothing else. One cold afternoon he surprised me. Could I come to the clinic with you sometime? I studied him carefully. Are you sure? I owe some people an apology. I didn't ask which people. At the clinic, the room went awkward the moment he was recognized from the newspaper coverage. Then Frank Morrison rolled forward in his wheelchair and punctured the tension with the precision of a man who has survived too much to waste time on ceremony. Well, Frank said loudly, Look who decided to rejoin civilized society." My father laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, nothing performed in it. And then, for perhaps the first time in his life, Walter Hayes sat down in a room full of people and simply listened. He listened to veterans talk about marriages that hadn't survived deployments. He listened to widows describe the specific quality of loneliness that follows retirement. He listened to men his own age admit that they had spent entire decades confusing silence with strength. And somewhere in the listening, something in him that had been clenched for 30 years began to ease. Daniel rebuilt more slowly and more honestly. He sold the house he couldn't afford, took a steady office job, started attending Gamblers Anonymous twice a week. The first months were humbling in the thoroughgoing way that actual change usually requires. One evening, we repaired fencing along the back pasture, while the sun went down over the marshlands. "I used to think success meant people envying you," he said. "And now?" He hammered a nail into the post. "Now I think peace might be worth more." That sounded like something he'd actually arrived at rather than borrowed. By spring, I decided what the estate should become. Not a monument, not a symbol of anything, something useful. With Patricia's help, I established the Hayes Veterans Retreat, a nonprofit offering temporary housing and real support for older veterans, military widows, and seniors facing the particular cruelty of financial ruin in old age. Not luxury, dignity. Simple rooms, warm meals, quiet safety, and people around who understood what it meant to have served and then been forgot. The first residents arrived in March. An Army widow from Macon, whose son had lost her retirement savings to bad investments. A retired mechanic living out of his truck after medical debt had taken everything. A Navy nurse with early Parkinson's and no family close enough to help. Watching them settle into those rooms changed what the house felt like. For the first time, it was useful rather than impressive. My father helped more than anyone had predicted. He started by repairing furniture to keep his hands busy. Then he started organizing donation pickups, fixing the porch railing, teaching younger volunteers the carpentry he'd learned 50 years ago building Savannah. One afternoon, I found him in the garden showing an old Marine how to plant tomatoes, both of them arguing companionably about soil depth the entire time. It was the most content I had seen him in years. The official opening ceremony fell on Veterans Day. Nothing elaborate. Folding chairs under the oak trees, coffee, homemade pies, neighbors, veterans, their families, the quiet, ordinary texture of community. Judge Whitmore came and sat in the back without drawing attention to himself. Patricia arrived wearing her permanent expression of mild dissatisfaction with everything, which meant she was pleased. Several reporters came, but this time not for scandal, for something else. Near the end of the gathering, Daniel tapped his glass. "I think Dad wants to say something." My father looked at him with pure irritation. "I told you not to do that." Light laughter moved through the chairs. Then Walter stood slowly, leaning on his cane, and the crowd went quiet with the particular attentiveness people give to moments that feel earned. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "My daughter spent most of her life protecting people," he said carefully, "including people who didn't deserve it." My chest tightened. He cleared his throat. "For years, I introduced Margaret as someone who needed help." He paused. "The truth is, she's the strongest person I've ever known." Nobody made a sound. Even the breeze seemed to hold. "And I wasted too many years," he added, quieter now, being too proud to say so. I walked over before he could finish and put my arms around him. He held on in the way that people hold on when they've spent too long not doing it. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the back porch. The estate glowed softly behind me, rooms full of voices, the small, ordinary sounds of people settling in for the night. The Spanish moss moved in the last of the light. I thought about revenge. About how badly I had once wanted my father to simply understand what his blindness had cost me. And I thought about how, when the moment finally came, it felt nothing like victory. Victory would have been a father who knew how to love openly from the beginning. But life doesn't often give us the ending we needed. Sometimes it only gives us the true one. If there's anything this story taught me, It's that the quiet people in our lives are often carrying the heaviest weight, the ones passed over at family dinners, underestimated in courtrooms, dismissed because they don't perform their own worth loudly enough. Those are often the people holding entire families together without receiving a single word of acknowledgement for it. So if someone in your life loves quietly, notice them. And if pride has kept you from saying what someone has long deserved to hear, don't wait as long as we did.